So in this section of the tutorial, we're going to continue the sculpting process. We're going to start where we left off from the previous tutorial. So if you're not watching these in order, then you'll need to load the file 6portraitsculpt1.crv3d from the project folder. Before we go ahead and create our texture and start to work with it, we're going to tidy the part up a little. First, I want to make sure that this is on my components layer. If I right mouse click, say move to layer, I can see it's on the eyeballs layer. And that must have been our currently selected layer when we did the sculpting. So I'm going to select components so that that component is on that layer now, and pop up the layer manager and just switch off the eyes and the eyeballs that I currently have drawn as vectors. I'm going to select the components layer because that's where I would like to see anything new that I do created or moved on to when I edit it. Next, I'm going to switch on the bitmap layer because I want to get to the image. We're going to go to the modeling tab, and I'm just going to rename my component to here because it's got a very long name at the moment, and I'm just going to call that Fin Sculpt, as in finish sculpt. So that's the component that we were just working on in the previous tutorial, where we did all our final sculpting in order to start to blend together the individual components. For a moment, I'm going to switch that off. I'm going to select my bitmap and I'm going to generate a texture from it. So we're going to come up to create a component from selected bitmap with that selected, and it will automatically take what we've got selected and create a component from it, and just give it the same name as the imported image. In this case, I'm going to right mouse click and rename that texture. We'll maximize the 3D view and take a look at this. Typically, you're going to see a lot of noise in a texture, and that could be from the compression of the image as a JPEG, or it could be in the original image. In this case, we've got a photograph of a painting, and the painting may have its own textures and subtleties of brushstrokes and things like that, which have become part of the image too. So here what I'm going to do first, and what I would normally do with any kind of texture like this, is do a smoothing pass on it. So if we go to the smoothing filter, need to make sure it's selected. That was what that error message was for. Pick it from the list. We're going to select the component, and we'll go ahead and slide the smooth up, and we'll go maybe around 2/3 of the way along there. I don't want to get rid of all the detail, but I do want to try and minimize the noise that's in this. So if I hit OK, I can see I've got my smooth component now. This is going to act as a skin that we add on to the shape that we created before. If we switch back on our sculpted model, we can see that even just looking at the rough version added to our original has given it all kinds of detail that wasn't there, in terms of the hair, in terms of some of the lines on the face, and certainly in terms of some of the frills we've got on the clothing down the bottom here. So what I may want to do before I start to sculpt this is to crop my texture component back to my underlying shapes. So if we go and tile the two windows, I have my texture component here. I may need to force that back. So if I say move to back, now I can see my original set of components, or single component as it is now since we baked it. And what I want to do is crop my texture to this component. So first I select the texture component, then I hold shift down and also select the sculpted component, and then I come over to the clear area outside of the second selected objects, and that should just crop my texture back to my component. Okay. So next I need to do some sculpting on my texture. I've got some basic shape there, but I really need to go in and start to get rid of some of the things that shouldn't be there and start to accentuate some of the other areas. So I'm going to switch off my sculpt component, and I'm going to look at the texture. I'm going to zoom in and go to the sculpting mode. One of the first things I notice where I've got a problem here is that there appears to be like a little spot that's appeared on the nose. If we look back at the original image, we'll see that that's just a highlight that the painter painted in. But because of the way we create this texture component from the image, those highlights will be picked up and given a shape. So they're the sort of things that I need to blend out here. I would do that, just go straight to the smudge tool, kind of 1/3 of the total strength here and an appropriate sized diameter, and just start to smudge that out. And really the key to cleaning up this texture is to smudge and smooth the sort of orange peel texture that we've got out of this, but not to get rid of any of the lines or any of the things that are being shown here. So as I smooth these, I'm going to follow the shapes that are there. So you can see I'm going to pick out lines that I know I want to represent as shapes and just follow those shapes and just carefully come in and start to smudge and smooth this. And really we're just going to repeat that process all around the face. So what I'm going to do here is just go ahead and pause the recording. I will do that set of smoothing and smudging on the texture, and then we'll resume again in a second and we'll look at some of the other areas like the hair and the clothes. So I'll just hit pause now. Okay, so once again we've jumped forward in time here. You can see I've done a lot of the smoothing on the face and smudging in order to get a lot of the roughness out of this. One area I did want to discuss is the area under the nose. You can see here we lose some of the detail, and that's essentially because we have a shadow there if we look at the original image. So I do need to be careful about that and try to avoid the shadow becoming too strong of a shape. And so I may need to take the shapes like I'm doing here and just smudge them up into that shadow area. Now you can see I haven't sculpted this completely perfectly, in that I haven't worried about every tiny little bit of texture that's in here, but that I've just tried to get the worst of it off. We are going to do another round of sculpting once we take this texture and put it on top of our other image, so it doesn't need to be completely perfect at this point in time. Next, let's talk about the hair. On the hair, I could go ahead and sort of carefully come in and start to smooth over this in order to lower down this texture that we've got, and that is going to reduce some of the definition that I've got in here. And what I want to do with the hair is really just try and define a representation of it, so almost an illustrative representation rather than an actual representation of every single strand of hair. And in this case, if I look at the painting, I can see how that was done by the painter. And essentially just to look at the areas in here and try to accentuate some of the stuff that's there by saying that I want to deposit material, a relatively small diameter that sort of corresponds to these sort of ringlets of hair that we've got here, up the strength a little, and then I'm going to come in and just literally start to build up material in these areas. So you can see I'm just following the shape of following the direction of the shapes that are already there and just trying to accentuate them. So first I would do the things that were very obvious and in these areas, and I would continue to add material and probably go all over the head of hair in order to do this. And again, I'm just looking at the image and just kind of sketching in almost where I would see the need for additional layers of this hair. But this isn't looking very attractive in the way that this is being done, but I'm just trying to build up enough material, because what I would do then is come to the smudge tool and take and start to actually blend these areas and give them the kind of shape that we see in the painting. And again, you just want to carefully follow what's already there, use that as a guide, and then just get the smoothness and the flow using the smudge tool here into the part. So again, what I'm going to do here is pause and work on the hair until it's finished, and then we'll resume the video once the hair's done. Okay, so there you'll have seen the image jump forward, and you can see what I've done with the sculpting of the hair. Haven't probably spent quite as much time on this as you may want to, but it's a pretty good representation, and certainly if I compare that to the image, then I'm getting the same kind of idea of the shape and the flow and dimension of the hair. And this also is going to machine reasonably well because it's not overly detailed. If you put too much detail into the hair, then you're just not going to pick up all the strands and texture and everything by the time you actually go and put a toolpath on it. So you do need to be aware of that as you're sculpting this. Finally, to finish off this part, I would go and work on the clothes. To start with on the clothes, I'd probably use the smoothing tool, a reasonably high strength as we've got set here, and a reasonably high or reasonably large diameter cursor. And I would just go over and roughly smooth over these. Again, being kind of careful to go with the flow of the shapes and try not to go over any of the detailed parts. And then in the middle here, I've got something I'm going to be relying on to give me the shape. I haven't modelled this frilly part on the front of the shirt, the ruff, at all. So what I'm going to do, because I'd noticed right at the start of my process that I got a reasonable texture in that area, is basically just build up that texture that I've got there. So if I just smooth that area out, I would come in and just like I did with the hair, I would deposit to add material to play parts of this I wanted to accentuate, and then just go back with the smudge tool in order to blend those in to what we've got there and to fit the shape and the flow. Once again, I'm going to pause the video at this point. I'm going to do the sculpting on the clothes and then we'll finish this section up. Okay, so now we've jumped forward in time. You can see the additional sculpting put in on the rough area, the smoothing around the rest of the clothes. I'm just going to hit keep and OK for the sculpting that I've done there. If we come back into the 2D view, into the 3D view, we'll go to an ISO view. If I switch on my Finesse Sculpt layer, we can see that that makes quite a difference to what we had before. If we switch the texture off, we can see the original model, and then with the texture added onto it there, we really start to get the detail. At this point in time, with a little more sculpting, I'd actually have something that is really quite a respectable finished product, and I could probably go ahead and send to the customer and get approval from them. What we're going to do is a last stage that I call finesse sculpting, and this is really where you would take it and from being a good likeness and really fix any problems that you see in the model and start to tweak some very, very small details. And we're going to deal with that in the next and final one of the tutorials that covers the actual Aspire work on the portrait. To get ready for that, I'm going to go ahead and take my two components here. I'm going to group them, and I will call that, I'll just rename that and call that Sculpt Texture 1. Right mouse click on that. I'm going to duplicate it. Then I'm going to switch off my original and I'm going to rename this new one and call this Final Sculpted Version. And that's what we're going to work on in the tutorial that follows this. So again, just to briefly summarize what we've just done in this tutorial, we took our texture, we created a texture from the image, and then we went ahead and did a reasonable amount of sculpting on that texture. It's no good just relying on it as it comes because it will have a lot of noise in it. It will have things like shadows and highlights that need to be got rid of because we don't want them to be part of the model. And then there'll be areas like the hair and the ruff in this case where we've got a reasonable shape already there, but we can really help ourselves by accentuating it to get our final version. And that's what you can see on the screen here if we just deselect. And as I say, we've already got a pretty good likeness going here that we're going to just very subtly finish as we come into the last stage in the next tutorial. I'll go ahead and save this and we'll call it 7 Portrait Sculpt 2, and that'll be the finished version at the end of this particular tutorial.